Hey there, this is Natalie, and in this video I want to talk about the controversial new winter 2021 anime series Redo of Healer, based on the light novels by Rui Tsukiyo. I want to talk about this show because while the backlash to it was predictable, and nobody who was aware of the type of story this is from the source material was expecting this adaptation to launch quietly, especially once the real nature of it becomes apparent in episode 2. I also think it is an interesting idea to discuss. What makes the edgiest of stuff appealing? So in this video, I'm going to be talking about edge, and dark ideas and villain protagonists and all of that stuff, and the nature of the market for them. I won't be spoiling the plot of Redo of Healer beyond what you must surely already have heard, and I'll be using fairly innocuous imagery from the show in this video, so it's safe to watch whether you are planning to watch Redo of Healer and don't want to be spoiled, or whether you are avoiding seeing things from Redo of Healer due to the graphic nature of them. This is going to be a discussion of the type of story this is, and why stories like it are appealing. And so, while you could take this as a defence of Redo of Healer to some extent, I am defending it as a work within its own niche, aimed at its own target audience, rather than trying to persuade you that you should like it, or that you're lame if you find it to be way over the line. What you can take this as a defence of, though, is the people who like Redo of Healer, and of the author. Before I get into the topic, please consider subscribing if you like anime content like this. I mostly do ReZero and Attack on Titan analysis and theories, as well as coverage of the anime and source material, so it's not all controversy based, and I really need the love, so click the buttons down below to support me. Not the dislike one though, although I feel like this video is going to earn more of those than usual. So, I've seen a lot of people reacting that Redo of Healer is something that can only be enjoyed by incels, or implying that liking it means some pretty bad things about a person, which I'm not going to repeat because I want to somehow keep this video safe for YouTube. Now, some of this is just going to be the usual SJWs, who are always going to be offended by Redo of Healer, and who are also offended by Uzaki-chan wants to hang out. And we're all used to that corner of the internet sounding off at this point, never saying anything of any real critical worth. So who cares? I don't for a moment think that the people who like this series, or its author, are bothered by that kind of thing, any more than anybody is bothered by people who think you're a psychopath if you like playing Doom Eternal. But in other cases, I think it's more that a lot of people, especially Gen Z anime fans, are seeing Redo of Healer as probably the first piece of media that comes from its particular genre, and are just genuinely shocked that something like this is an anime, and are thinking, well, who could enjoy something with all this indefensible stuff in it? Sure, stuff like this has always been known to exist in the category of the H thing, and that's one of a few words I'm not going to be able to say in this video, but need to use to make these points. And aside from being a longer work with a bigger plot than is typically found in the H thing, where budgets are lower and the OVA type format is more usual than there being a full seasonal anime adaptation of a mature manga or light novel, it's really completely fair to consider Redo of Healer as being just that. In Japan, it's apparently made quite clear by the channels it's on, most of them being pay-per-view with age restrictions for the uncensored version, and from its time slot, that it's intended for the audience it is intended for. And this is definitely not a case of something really graphic being somehow disguised as a fantasy anime for teenagers with some fan service in it, like the frankly terrible The Hidden Dungeon Only I Can Enter, or something like that. But whether or not this is true in Japan, I don't know, but where its format is that of a normal seasonal anime, people who wouldn't normally watch, or at least talk about watching the H thing, are finding and discussing Redo of Healer in the Western anime community. Some people are shocked and a little bit scared that Redo of Healer is, in the West at least, right there next to stuff like "that time I got reincarnated as a slime" and "so I'm a spider, so what" in this season's batch of fantasy anime, and that some people they follow or interact with in the anime community are saying they like it. And I don't think that's a weird reaction, but I do think it's one that comes from a place of innocence about the place edgy concepts have in fiction, and the reasons why they can be appealing, rather than because Redo of Healer is a uniquely shocking story that has come out of nowhere to the joy of horrible people everywhere. You may think someone who enjoys seeing these concepts of revenge and a protagonist doing basically the worst stuff he can come up with to people, or someone who finds the lewder aspects of these concepts appealing to watch, you know what I'm talking about, must have a pretty dark view of the world, or must harbour some messed up ideas about what they'd like to do to women. But it's not that way. Plenty of perfectly sane, socially functional people who are in or capable of healthy relationships are never going to commit any serious crime, and believe it or not are more than occasionally women, like and seek out edgy fiction, including stuff with the kind of themes we see in Redo of Healer. And that's not just me being generous about an audience, that's something that there is plenty of evidence for, and which people in certain corners of the entertainment industry, including writers, are pretty familiar with. While things like the social media backlash to certain scenes in both mainstream media like Game of Thrones and anime like Goblin Slayer may make it seem like everyone is fine with Edge when it's about killing, violence and torture, but if anything involving the R thing appears, then the majority view is that the work is indefensible, and the author and fans who thought it was fine for that to be in the plot of the work are terrible people. This is really not how a lot of people feel. A lot of people, again, not just men, who like stuff that explores the darker aspects of things and which aims to be uncomfortable, shocking or horrifying, prefer that nothing that is possible or which exists in that sphere of dark things is left as taboo in their fiction just because of its particular sensitivity as a topic in the real world right now. And consider we have a whole mainstream genre called horror, so it's not remotely rare for humans to like experiencing shock and discomfort through fiction. But that argument really only goes part of the way to explaining why a story like Redo of Healer has its appeal. The usual way of grimdark, dark fantasy or horror type things is to establish a bleak and cruel setting where horrifying things can and do happen, to put a hero or a weak everyman in difficult positions and explore the kind of horrible things people might do to each other in given circumstances, or to put the characters at the mercy of uncaring cosmic entities, creating despair. This discussion that, hey, people enjoy things that are scary and shocking and savage in stories, and don't really want to exclude certain types of horrifying concepts just because of current social hot topics, covers things like Berserk or Goblin Slayer just fine, but still doesn't go quite far enough to explain the appeal of Redo of Healer. Redo of Healer goes far beyond something like Goblin Slayer, which uses these controversial things to make the setting feel grim and to motivate the hero into wanting to destroy the perpetrators of these crimes. By giving us a story about a person so broken by the grimness of the setting that when power becomes available to them, they spend it on having their revenge. The normality of wanting Goblin Slayer to succeed because he hates the goblins because they do terrible things is not there in this case. Morally, with Redo of Healer, we're put in the position of understanding why the protagonist is bent on revenge, but also seeing him do indefensible things as part of that. It's not difficult really to see why watching someone take some really messed up revenge on the people and world that did them wrong is interesting in a story. It's not a rare plot at all, and even in stories which have conventional protagonists, a lot of people like watching the villains best. So why would it be weird to make someone who has broken bad the focus of the story? But it's still a bit more complicated than understanding why people like watching a good protagonist like Goblin Slayer fight against the evil goblins. To get why they like watching someone get broken, cross the line into darkness, and go on a rampage of doing the cruelest things they can to those from their past. The R stuff in Goblin Slayer is also solely there for establishing something about the world and plot, and to most people wasn't there for titillation, whereas Redo of Healer, well, nobody would argue that that show, which is an R-rated series with censored and uncensored versions available, isn't including its most shocking scenes with titillation in mind. But again, the darkness of something like that appearing in what is basically the H thing in a seasonal anime format doesn't mean it's only there to appeal to people with very specific fetishes or people who hate women. For those who don't know this, because I don't mention it much in my videos, I made a living as an author as well as being a ghostwriter for a number of years before I got massive writer's block from lockdown last year and decided to start an anime YouTube channel where I was finding it easier to talk about other people's stories than come up with anything of my own. A good amount of the stuff I've written as myself rather than for ghostwriting clients, on this pen name at least, is on the lewd side. My books were not so edgy, where I tend to stay within the rules of what Amazon will sell. Most of them are more just isekai harem stuff that just doesn't stop at fan service. But writing mature content for a living, I have gotten to know a lot of other authors in that part of the industry, and I came to know and understand the authors and the audience for darker, edgier fiction. And it's really not what a lot of people who are afraid of what something like Redo of Healer being popular could mean are imagining. Authors who write the English language equivalents of Redo of Healer, dark fantasy villain protagonist type stories with heavy lewd content, at least the ones I know, are not sinister, gross people who never speak to women. I mean, some of them are women, and of the males, obviously, if I know them, that means they've at least spoken to me, because I'm a woman. They're no different from people who write any other kind of genre fiction successfully. They know the expectations of the audience for the niche of fiction they're writing, and they use their creativity to come up with stories that are engaging for that audience. But the audience for Western equivalents of Redo of Healer, just like the audience for the harem stuff I write, is typically male. And so why do I keep saying that it's not a male incel thing to like this kind of edge? Well, for this, I'm going to have to introduce you to the concept of a hugely popular book genre in the West, known as dark romance. Dark romance, like basically all romance genre books in the West, is aimed almost 100% at women, and is usually written by women too. I say in the West because in Japanese media it's different, with romance and romantic comedy genre fiction aimed at men and boys being much more of a thing. Romance in the book industry is a technical term and refers to a genre of fiction that always includes certain features. So be aware here that I'm talking about romance as a thing with a very strict definition, rather than romance as more of a vague concept, which can appear in all kinds of stories aimed at just about any audience. Romance in this strict sense is genre fiction that has, as its primary plot, the start of a new romantic relationship, and which has to end with the main characters together in a serious capacity, most commonly with a classic happily ever after, often with an epilogue that talks about how they're still together years later and have had a bunch of babies. So you'd think that this would be the kind of comfort food fiction that people would read purely because it's generally uplifting, and you know, given the rules of the romance genre, that no matter what drama goes on in the middle, nobody's gonna die or end up alone, and things will work out for the main characters and end happily. You would think that the audience for this would be very much the opposite of the audience for dark fantasy and edge, or at the very least be the same people in very different moods. But dark romance, which still follows the arc of a relationship beginning that becomes permanent by the end of the story, often involves really unhealthy relationships, and things like the heroine falling in love with someone who has done dark things to her, often with ideas like Stockholm Syndrome being thrown in, and it's a hugely popular subset. The R thing comes up all the time in this genre, and so do other concepts you might see in dark fantasy like slavery, and the audience for this genre is women. Equally, dark romance like Redo of Healer is written with titillation in mind, and the edgy stuff in it is not framed as it would be in a thriller or whatever, but with pretty much the same level of detail and similar language as love scenes get in the non-dark adult romances. Romance as a whole is, by orders of magnitude, the biggest selling genre of fiction, outselling every other genre combined consistently for as long as mainstream fiction has been a thing. And dark romance is not a small part of it, and yet it's enjoyed for basically the exact same reasons people enjoy Redo of Healer and stuff in darker genres more typically aimed at men. People, not just weird dudes, like stuff that's disturbing, and when it's all fiction and fantasy, it's really not weird or unhealthy for both men and women to think the combination of the spicy lewd stuff and the disturbing stuff is entertaining. But with all of that said about why Redo of Healer exists within what is actually a pretty heavy populated and established style of fiction, and so really isn't anything groundbreaking or shocking other than being in a different format as an anime to what things of its kind usually are, and about why the people who like it are probably not what you think. What about Redo of Healer specifically as a work in this context? Is it actually a good execution of the concepts it's using, or is it just another trashy, provocative piece of media to add to the pile? Well, I would say that it does do what it's trying to do well. There are certain things that need to occur on a fairly regular basis in a story in this genre to meet the expectations of the audience it was created for, like, well, love scenes. And author Rui Tsukiyo has found ways to incorporate that into the plot in a way that doesn't feel as low effort and basic as the hidden dungeon only I can enters system of the protagonist getting magic points every time he gets a bit turned on by his elbow touching a boob or a glimpse of some pantsu, but also means the plot doesn't need to be stalled by some convoluted scenario to get to every lewd scene. The protagonist, along with everybody else in the setting, is willfully unlikable, and so if you feel like stories only work for you when you have a main character you can root for, then this is going to be hard to grasp the appeal of, though it is the norm for this kind of story. However, Rui Tsukiyo has taken more the approach of giving us a villain protagonist who might once have been a likeable hero if he'd been in a totally different setting and story. Rather than the kind of villain protagonist in something like American Psycho, who's always supposed to seem like a person whose psychopathic ways are alien to the reader, this is more of a dark story about someone who got messed up along the way, but taken to the extremes of that, rather than brought back by the power of love or friendship or his own sense of what's right, like we see with conventional protagonists. From the perspective of character, disregarding the lewd stuff, which I feel like I've talked about enough, finding out what happens as the conclusion of someone crossing the moral event horizon after being broken down by the world they're in, even though there's nothing left to like about the protagonist and no hope for them to be redeemed, is really no different to what makes things like the darker ReZero if roots like Pride and Wrath, where the usually likeable and relatable Subaru becomes a monster, work. Where ReZero author Tappei Nagatsuki manages to make it believable that the character we usually root for could have ended up that way had things been different, in Redo of Healer, Rui Tsukiyo shows us only that bad path, and seeing just how bad it can get, just how this kid who wanted to be a hero ends up with his only goal being to create very specific suffering for those who ruined that for him, gives it a complexity that only enhances the darkness of it. Sure, we can't endorse the things protagonist Kaoru does, or relate to the person he's become, but we can easily believe in how he got there, and that a similar path might be taken by plenty of people in such a messed up setting. That kind of thing is harder to write than the villain protagonist stories where the main character is just a psycho who is, from the start, a unique character with nothing in common with the audience or with more heroic protagonists, or revenge power fantasy type stories where the main character still remains someone you don't feel particularly weird about wanting to see succeed in their revenge, like in something like Kill Bill. Essentially then, I think Redo of Healer is going to be something that the audience for it, who get what it's trying to do, are going to really like, because it is really competently done as a work of its kind. I would then recommend it to people who do like its genre, but to those who don't see the appeal, I'd also say that it does have its comparative merits as a story from that genre, and so if people say they like it, don't dismiss them as just trying to pwn the SJWs by liking the latest controversial thing. Yeah, you do kinda have to be a bit of an edgelord to want to watch it in the first place, but a lot of us are, and it's reductive to say that that's all there is to this author's work, which is, at the end of the day, good at what it does. So that's my take on Redo of Healer and the controversy around it. I'd be interested to know what you guys think in the comments, though please keep it civil. This is a more charged topic than I normally talk about on my channel, unless you count the ever-controversial subject of the CGI in Attack on Titan, so I'm not really sure what to expect by covering it, but I do think it's interesting, and so I do want to hear what your own takes on it are, even if you don't agree with anything I just said. Once again, please subscribe for more anime analysis and discussion, and thank you so much for watching.